Okay, the topic of today's video lecture is going to be sectionalism. I'm going to try and keep it brief here, and I apologize for the stuffy nose. I'm a little congested right now, kind of battling a little something. Got kind of this funky green snot all balled up in here that actually kind of matches the color of my shirt. So if you're still with me after that and you're not vomiting into your trash can beside your computer, we can get on. Sectionalism. It's a topic that we've talked quite a bit about, and in fact, I'll get a map up here that kind of shows it for us nice and good. So we've got sectionalism, and this beautiful map here, which really illustrates it. So just take a look at that map for a second, and just kind of listen, with the definition of sectionalism. Sectionalism is simply loyalty to the region of your interests. I did that this morning, loyalty to the interest of your region rather than the country as a whole. So loyalty to the interest of your region or section, right? So we have our northern section, right? Loyalty. These folks would be loyal to the interest of their northern region. We have the southern section here. They would be loyal to their southern region. They would care more about their interests or what matters to them rather than the country as a whole. And we also kind of have this western section. So that's the simple definition. Loyalty to the interests of your region or section rather than the nation as a whole. A couple of things we talked about. A tariff, tax on imported goods. The North supports the tariff. The South opposes the tariff. Another thing, states' rights. The North more opposed to states' rights. The South more supporting states' rights. Internal improvements, railroads and things like that. The North supporting it. The South opposed to it, right? So these are different examples of sectionalism. However, our biggest example of sectionalism is slavery. And not so much, slavery in these areas, but the expansion of slavery. If you take a look at this beautiful little illustration here, the fire that you see here, that represents slavery. The North does not want the fire to spread to the West. The South wants to spread that fire, right? The South wants to spread slavery as the country is expanding. And keep in mind, going back a couple units, we're talking about manifest destiny right now, that belief that the United States will stretch from sea to shining sea, which we all know. And we've talked quite a bit about that, and we look closely at manifest destiny, but that really sets this off because the North, as we're expanding, says, no way, slavery stays. Part of the reason for the motivation of not wanting to expand slavery is purely economics. It's purely money. Slavery, after all, as horrible as it is, it's cheap labor. It's free labor. And the North has a lot of people moving out this way. And if they aren't able to find jobs, it's not really going to be a good thing. Not as many of them are going to move, and slavery is going to expand. The South will have more representation in Congress. The South, on the other hand, of course, the South wants to expand slavery. Think of it this way, right? The nation, we use this analogy in class, like the nation is like a growing mother. Mama's getting pregnant. When she gets pregnant, she has states. All right, think of the North as like the boys. Boys want more boys to be born. The South, think of them as girls. Girls want more girls to be born. So the South, as each state comes in, they want them to be slave states. The North, as each state comes in, they want them to be free states. All right, so that's kind of our big issue with sectionalism right here. And this is also, our leading cause of the Civil War. What caused the Civil War? Slavery? Yes, but a better answer is sectionalism. Loyalty to the interest of your region or state rather than the nation as a whole. All right, so let's rewind back to 1820, right? 40 years before the Civil War even begins, talking about the Missouri Compromise. This was our first effort to kind of settle this sectionalism issue. During this time, we have Missouri right here that wants to come in to the Union as a state. All right, the South is like, make Missouri a slave state. The North is like, make Missouri a free state. And they're arguing back and forth. And then they think about it and they think, well, we got a brilliant idea. Instead of upsetting the representation, having more slave states than free states, let's add one slave state and one free state. So let's take a look at the Missouri Compromise here, right? They basically drew this line. Think of it as like if you're ever fighting with your brother and sister, right? And you just keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Then eventually the folks step in and they put a line down the room, or maybe you draw a line down the room. Think of this Missouri Compromise line right here, this line that extends out. Think of that as like that piece of tape in the room, right? We're going to see that it doesn't stick. Right? So this piece of tape in the room that doesn't stick. And below this line, no slavery. Above this line, slavery is allowed. So that's the first thing we do. We really bring in these sectional differences, right? No slavery, no slavery, slavery. No slavery, slavery. Yeah, ignore that little screw up there, right? So Missouri comes in as a slave state, and we also bring in Maine as a free state. One slave state, one free state. We're keeping the balance even, and then we're extending out, saying these can be free, these can be slave, and we'll leave it at that. That's the Missouri Compromise. Does the Missouri Compromise work? Well, yeah. I mean, for 30 years, it avoids a civil war, but eventually that piece of tape in the room is going to come up. This is going to get all muddled, and we're going to have a real problem in 1850 because the tape did not stick. And that brings us to the Compromise of 1850. No fancy name, but the Compromise of 1850. The North, following the California Gold Rush, or California following the Gold Rush in 1849, looking to become a state. There are thousands of people out there that are ready to become a state. Trouble is, everyone wants them to come in as a free state. And the South again say, well, that's not fair, that's not fair. The North will have more representation. But they come up with kind of a slightly different compromise this time. They allow California to come in as a free state. This does lead to a shift in power in Congress because now there are more free state senators and more free state members in the House of Representatives. But what we do see happening is to keep the South happy, instead of giving them another state, the North passes the Fugitive Slave Act, which basically says any runaway slaves that make it to the North, by law, every citizen living in the North is required by law to return them back to their masters, to their owners in the South. All right. This makes abolitionists, the people who are opposed to slavery, furious. Right? They're saying, what? We already think slavery is wrong. We already think it should end. And now by law, you are saying that if we help a runaway slave, that we're breaking the law in the North and that we are forced to return them to the South? So this makes abolitionists like Harriet Tubman and William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, this gets these abolitionists fired up. And this really ratchets up the tension between the North and the South over slavery. These northern citizens are getting upset. Not the federal government, but the northern citizens. All right, that is our second compromise, that we're kind of teetering on the brink of a civil war here. And that brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in about 1855, I want to say 1855. And what they decide here is we've got this territory here, the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Let's see if we can find a better map for us here. We've got this Kansas and Nebraska territory here looking to become a state. And they decide that they're going to determine the fate of this state via popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty, that's just a fancy way of meaning that the people get to vote. And so, because Kansas is ready to come into the Union as a territory, and is it going to be free? Is it going to be slave? Is it going to be free? Is it going to be slave? It's the $1,000,000 question. They say, well, why don't we let the people decide? Bad idea. Seems like a great idea, horrible idea, because now you have all these radical abolitionists rushing into the Kansas territory, and all these radical slave supporters rushing into the Kansas territory. Each side is being flooded with people, flooded with potential voters, and it ultimately leads to an incident known as Bleeding Kansas, right? Where there is literally a civil war being fought in the state of Kansas 4 or 5 years prior to the Civil War actually beginning, led by a man named John Brown. We talked about him. He led this rampage where he went and killed a slave family, a slave-owning family, massacred them, killed some people, marched on to Harper's Ferry, where he was planning on leading this big uprising. He was eventually captured and found himself on the business end of a rope as he was hung for treason. But we see that Kansas-Nebraska, following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, letting the people choose through popular sovereignty, was kind of this disaster, all right? So sectionalism is leading up to this civil war between North and South, slave and free. And then finally, 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected, and boom goes the dynamite, right? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected, and the South says, that's it, we've had it. Now they're worried that Abraham Lincoln is going to abolish slavery. Lincoln never once said, I'm an abolitionist, I'm going to abolish slavery, I'm going to end slavery, I'm going to stop the spread of slavery. Never said any of those things. But the South was worried, right? The South was worried. Lincoln's been elected. He's this northern Republican, and he's worried. That's it. We're not going to worry about it. You can take a look at this map in 1860, right? All these blue northern states, these free states voting for Lincoln, these green states basically voting for the Democratic candidate, who was a guy named Breckinridge at the time. And then there's also this Constitutional Union guy named Bell. But it's the election is based it's a sectional election. The North votes for someone that they view as anti-slavery. The South votes as someone they view as pro-slavery. As soon as Lincoln's elected, the South basically says no, and South Carolina is our first state to secede. Eventually, 10 other states are going to follow. And when South Carolina breaks away in 1860, that brings us to the Civil War. All right, so that is sectionalism in a nutshell, talking about these compromises, right? North and South. Free states, slave states. Loyalty to the region of your interest or section rather than the nation as a whole. Be prepared to be able to talk about sectionalism and explain it, especially in great detail when we talk about those compromises. That's all for now. Do it to it.